There was almost 8 decades of peace in Europe until February 24, 2022, when Russia brought war back to Europe. As a result of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, all expectations of modern European power resolving their problems peacefully have been crushed. While NATO itself is on the verge of fighting a full-blown war against Russia, there are 4 possible ways in which this war can end, and the other 3 may surprise you just as much. A total of 30,000 Russian soldiers have been killed, captured, or wounded in action in just over 2 months of fighting, about 25% of the initial invasion force ground combat troops. Accordingly, such incredible casualty rates are not only unsustainable, but are also unprecedented. For example, the United States lost 58,220 soldiers killed in action during the Vietnam War. As a result, the Russian losses are already so severe that it will take approximately 2 years to replace its tank losses alone, and only if international sanctions are lifted from the nation so that it can once again access high-tech electronic components that it cannot manufacture at home. Russia will return to building tanks from the Cold War era if not, which, as we've seen, cannot withstand even man-portable NATO firepower, let alone a fully equipped NATO armored brigade. Despite a lot of talk about mobilization, Russian military insiders admit that mobilization will not help Russia win the war. If a replacement tank regiment were to be deployed within 90 days, it would be equipped with Cold War leftover tanks from Russia's vast reserves of very obsolete weapons. In Ukraine, these tanks and their entirely green conscript crews would perform worse than Russia's current tanks. Without lifting sanctions or retooling Russia's economy to produce high-tech electronics at home and build new aircraft, replacing Russia's dwindling air power assets is simply untenable. As a result, the war in Ukraine is most likely to end with a whimper, instead of a bang. Eventually, the flow of new equipment into Ukraine will outweigh the flow of obsolete Russian equipment. Military tech from NATO overpowers obsolete Cold War-era equipment, and Russian losses continue to mount as it attempts to break through Ukrainian defenses. In order to compensate for combat personnel losses, Russia mobilizes and floods the conflict with additional conscripts. In addition to being undertrained and poorly equipped, these conscripts also suffer from extremely low morale. In a war against a brother nation they didn't want to fight, the professional, volunteer soldiers whose morale is also slipping force them into combat under threat of punishment. In some cases under threat of death, as it's been reported that Chechen Kadyrovites have shot Russian soldiers who refused to fight. The influx of manpower has the opposite effect in the fighting that Russia is hoping for. Russian forces are already struggling to resupply the tens of thousands of conscripts they have already deployed on the front, so they need intense resupply. Due to low morale and poor training, Russia suffered massive casualties and surrenders in Ukraine engagements. Eventually, the bad morale becomes extremely infectious, causing very serious breakdowns in discipline. For example, one Russian tank commander's legs were crushed by a subordinate in anger at the extreme losses the unit sustained. The offensive eventually ends as it becomes impossible for the Russians to advance further into Ukraine. As Putin declares victory, he says that he has secured the Donbas region, Mariupol, and the important waterways leading into Crimea that Ukraine had previously dammed off after Russia illegally seized the peninsula in 2014. However, this still leaves Russia in control of very strategic and economically important regions of Ukraine, while choking off about half of Ukraine's exports. It falls far short of Putin's original goals of toppling the Ukrainian government and installing a puppet government. The situation is not great for Russia, but it's not awful either, and if one overlooks the staggering casualties it took to get here, one might even consider it a win. However, the Ukrainians would have to accept this situation, and it's unlikely that they are willing to simply give a quarter of their country over to the Russians, especially if they are winning. And while currently Ukraine isn't winning, it is definitely not losing either. There's every sign that despite Putin's earlier assurances that he wasn't interested in physically occupying Ukraine, that this is no longer the case, though given Putin's laundry list of lies to date, it's likely that this too was a pre-planned act of deception. In Russian-occupied areas, the Russian government is now guaranteeing pensions for Ukrainian citizens living there, as well as introducing the ruble as an official currency and even replacing street signs with those written in the Russian language. A massive effort to Russify the occupied territories is underway with frightening speed, and perhaps most worryingly of all is the fact that one of the first things being brought into occupied territories is Russian television. This means that for citizens in occupied Ukraine, their only news source is now Russian state-run news and its non-stop blitzkrieg of propaganda. Putin is clearly not planning on ceding occupied territories back to Ukraine, but what if Ukraine fights back? Across the modern Eastern Front in Ukraine, Ukrainian forces are pushing back against Russian positions and liberating villages. However, they are also losing ground in the south. The entire front has become a back and forth more reminiscent of 20th century wars, but the important part here is that Ukraine was not supposed to be able to push back Russian forces at all. Ukrainian forces were supposed to be completely overwhelmed by superior Russian firepower, and yet we've discovered that Russia is almost as big a threat to itself due to incompetence, bad morale, bad equipment, and worse training, as it is to Ukraine. Ukraine could simply refuse to accept Russian occupation and continue fighting. The United States of America has already pledged to continue supporting Ukraine militarily until, as House Speaker Nancy Pelosi put it, the fighting is done. Europe may not be so eager to support an ongoing war in Ukraine, but they don't have to be. In terms of overall contributions to Ukraine, Europe's contributions are a little above symbolic, with the lion's share of support coming from the United States. In recent meetings with American defense industry leaders, President Joe Biden worked to create a strategy for the ongoing resupply of Ukraine, even if the war lasts for years. As long as Ukraine is willing to fight, the U.S. looks willing to continue supporting it. And the longer Ukraine wants to fight, the worse it might get for the Russians. Already the initial U.S. stance on not supporting Ukraine with heavy equipment has shifted. This was due to the stunning performance of Ukrainian troops and the equally stunning incompetence of Russian troops. Western analysts predicted Ukraine would fall within 3 days, and nobody believed that Ukraine's military could survive, let alone beat back the Russian assault into Kyiv and beyond. Now that the U.S. believes Ukraine can fight for months, even for years, it opens up the door for providing Ukraine with heavier equipment. Already the U.S. has provided Soviet-built helicopters it has sourced from other nations, as well as other equipment that Ukrainians are already familiar with. However, if Ukraine is committed to fighting for years, and the stalemate in the East holds, there's reason to believe that the United States would begin arming Ukraine with modern, American equipment. This would require months of training for its crews, but after which Ukraine would be fielding capabilities far superior to Russia's own. This is only possible if Ukraine continues this fight for years, as it would take that long to train Ukrainian troops and create the logistical networks required for repairing and replenishing sophisticated equipment such as M1 Abrams. Yet if Ukraine has to date held against the Russian onslaught, for the time it takes for the nation to rearm itself with Western equipment, there's little reason it cannot maintain its status quo. Russia would lose badly in the East under an assault by Western-armed Ukraine. There are only two possible outcomes to this war. First, Russia must admit defeat humiliatingly, and then withdraw. With current equipment, Ukraine may be able to force this defeat condition even as the war costs continue to pile up for Russia. In any case, this would be an admission of catastrophic failure that will remain in Russian history forever. Nuclear, biological, and chemical weapons could be used against Ukrainian forces in the second way. Due to the lack of arms in Ukraine's arsenal, Russia has no reason to be concerned about retaliation. By creating propaganda that Ukraine itself has been developing chemical and biological weapons under the supervision of Russia's favorite bogeyman, the United States, Russia has already laid the foundation for justification for WMDUs. There are no UMs in Ukraine, and if they did, they would have used them when it appeared as though Russian troops were about to take Kyiv in the early hours of the war. Despite years of armament by the West, Putin may still resort to chemical, biological, or nuclear weapons even without Ukraine overpowering Russian troops. As President Joe Biden has said, appropriate responses will be taken. If Russia uses chemical weapons, the United States may launch a chemical attack against Russian troops inside Ukraine. It is unclear what this means, but it is feared that the United States will retaliate proportionately. For fear of escalating the situation, the US would not use such weapons inside Russia, and only a nuclear attack is likely to cause it to not respond tit for tat. The only thing Ukraine needs less than one nuclear attack on its own soil is 2 nuclear attacks on its territory. This brings us to another possibility for ending the Ukrainian conflict. A full-blown confrontation between NATO and Russia could result if Russia turned to using drones, and the United States responded in kind. And yet this is a nightmare scenario for Russia, given how extremely poorly its troops have performed against Ukraine's military, which is largely armed with Cold War weapons. Taking on NATO's professionally trained and well-equipped militaries would be a catastrophe of the highest order for Russian forces, and while before the West feared Russia's growing military might, the war in Ukraine has proven that Russia was a paper tiger all along. While Putin may speak tough against the West, he really should ask himself how many wars he wants to lose at once. NATO tanks are the last thing he wants outside Kaliningrad. It seems unlikely at first glance that the war in Ukraine could end, but if several key facts change, it's frighteningly possible. As of now, Russia bombs civilians and even specifically targets civilian shelters. Besides destroying civilian infrastructure in the east, Russia also bombs Lyiv's power plant, which is far west of where most fighting occurs. Despite having no military value, these random, civilian targets are far from random, because they have great terror value. He uses the same strategy Russia used in Syria, targeting civilians to create mass panic and fear throughout the country, eventually leading to peace. In Syria, terrorized civilians refused to support rebel forces, and in Ukraine, terrorized populations could demand that its military stop fighting. The Ukraine could surrender to Russia without being completely dominated by Russia if it lacked political will to fight. Because Russia lacks the military superiority that it had in Syria, this campaign of terror may backfire against it. However, if it succeeds, it would end up installing a pro-Kremlin leader into power. Since Russia seems to be planning on never returning occupied territories, and is even attempting to Russify them, a puppet leader could call for a referendum on Ukraine rejoining Russia. A Cold War diehard like Vladimir Putin might even rebrand Russia as the Soviet Union again. When Ukraine is pacified, Putin will inevitably invade Moldova. Russian general accidentally let slip what seems to be Putin's true agenda in Ukraine. By creating a land corridor across southern Ukraine, he not only cut Ukraine off from the sea and choked its economy, but also allowed access to Transnistria, the breakaway region of Moldova. As a result, Russian forces could pour into Moldova as well. He would be 2 steps closer to restoring the former Soviet Union to its full glory, with his eyes indubitably turning to Latvia, Lithuania, and Slovakia. Since the 3 nations are currently NATO members, it is unlikely Putin would attempt to invade them, especially after President Biden declared the US would fight for every inch of NATO territory. A small invasion into a Baltic state, just enough to take a few miles of border territory and then digging in defensively, was part of internal Russian brainstorming that led to this proclamation. A border incursion of insignificant importance would force NATO to engage in war with an entrenched Russian defense force. Since some NATO members did not want the Baltic states to join the alliance in the first place, due to their vulnerability to Russia, NATO may splinter internally over the enactment of Article 5. It could lead to NATO's collapse, especially among its most vulnerable members in the East. The United States and a few European countries would be fighting a war that is extremely unpopular. It is possible for Russia to win this confrontation with the West and take as much of the Baltics as it wants in such a scenario. Having restored the Soviet Union, Vladimir Putin would have greatly heightened the possibility of nuclear war,